It started on an unassuming Friday evening in late October, one of those Iowa evenings that arrives quietly, the sky the color of steel and the trees still holding on to the last of their golden leaves. The wind carried that smell of dying grass and cold soil, and everything outside hinted at the oncoming winter. I had spent most of the afternoon in the garage, reorganizing old tools I rarely used anymore, the ones I couldn't bring myself to throw out. Retirement gave me too much time to think, so I often found refuge in tasks that kept my hands busy and my mind silent. I just returned from the mailbox, flipping through flyers and utility bills, when I stepped into the kitchen and paused. Something immediately felt out of rhythm. On the counter were 2 wine glasses, side by side. One still had a faint red lipstick stain at the rim. Neither had been rinsed or moved, as if someone had left in a rush or hadn't cared to clean up. Beside them, a half-empty box of dark chocolates lay open. That alone would have meant nothing, except I don't drink wine, and I can't stand dark chocolate. I never have. I stood there for a while, staring at the items, trying to convince myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe she was trying something new. Maybe a friend had truly stopped by. But that didn't explain the other object, a branded white coffee mug resting by the sink, marked with the words, Swan and Keller LLP. A law firm I didn't recognize. It wasn't something we owned. The design was sleek and new, the kind of thing given at a conference or networking event. We'd never been the type to collect corporate mugs. The television in the living room was on low, some nature documentary about wild horses playing in the background. But the real noise was the sudden flurry of footsteps. Vanessa appeared from the hallway, barefoot, her hair in a loose ponytail, cheeks flushed slightly as if she'd just finished laughing. Or drinking. She greeted me with a smile that felt too deliberate. Not guilty, not awkward, just off. I've lived with this woman for almost 40 years. I've seen her smile 1,000 different ways. Joy, frustration, amusement, boredom. This one didn't fit. She walked past me, casually grabbing the wine glasses and slipping them into the dishwasher without comment. I asked her if someone had come over. She nodded without even turning around, saying it was just a quick visit from an old friend. A name wasn't offered. No details volunteered. Then, just as I was about to ask about the mug, she changed the subject. Something about the new neighbor's dog digging up flower beds and how we'd need to replace the fencing come spring. Her tone was light, her body language fluid, too relaxed for someone caught off guard. I followed her into the living room, still holding the unopened mail. The light from the lamp made the space feel warmer than it was. But even the warmth couldn't quiet what had begged *N to stir inside me. I didn't say anything further. I didn't want to argue. I sat down, pretended to read through an energy bill I'd already seen, while she flipped through channels like nothing was wrong. Later that night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan. Vanessa had fallen asleep almost instantly. She always did. But I couldn't. My mind kept looping through everything. The wine glasses, the lipstick, the chocolates, the mug. Not one of those things alone meant anything. But together, they didn't belong. It was like seeing a painting you've looked at for years, only now realizing something had been altered. A tree moved, a shadow deepened, a figure added in the background. Small changes, but unsettling. The next morning, I woke early and found myself wandering the house like a man searching for something he'd lost. I opened the trash bin and looked at the chocolate box. Imported, expensive, wrapped in gold foil. A brand she'd never mentioned before. The receipt was still inside the lid, purchased earlier that afternoon from a boutique store downtown. I made coffee, sat in silence, and watched the steam rise. We'd had our problems, sure. What marriage doesn't? But it wasn't that kind of relationship, at least I didn't think it was. We fought over little things like everyone else. The thermostat, her spending, my tendency to isolate when something upset me. But we'd never had deep betrayals. Or maybe I just hadn't known them when they were there. I found myself trying to remember the last time Vanessa had gone out with friends. Not family, not errands, just friends. Couldn't. Lately, she always claimed to be too tired, too busy. And yet, here was evidence of company. An evening I hadn't been told about. A story offered without details. a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Still, I said nothing. It wasn't fear. It was strategy. Or maybe denial. I decided to watch instead. Pay attention. I began to catalog moments, looks, behaviors. I told myself I was being ridiculous. But I didn't believe myself. Not really. Over the next few days, I thought often about that wine glass and the way she rushed to hide it. About the coffee mug, still sitting in the dishwasher rack like a forgotten witness. I even Googled the law firm out of idle curiosity. Swan and Keller LLP. Corporate litigation. Based out of Chicago with a small presence in Cedar Rapids. Nothing stood out except that we had no reason to know them. Vanessa acted as though nothing had happened. She went about her routine, humming while cooking, laughing at game shows, sending texts with that little knowing smile she used to save for private jokes between us. But now it was aimed at someone invisible on the other end of her phone. On Sunday, she announced she'd be attending a weekend wellness retreat with some women from her yoga class. It wasn't unusual. She'd done it once before last spring. But this time, the way she said it felt rehearsed. When I asked which friend she was going with, she paused, then replied too quickly. That night, I checked her yoga bag. Nothing incriminating, just a mat, a change of clothes, a water bottle. But underneath the clothes, carefully folded and wrapped in tissue paper, was a black cocktail dress I'd never seen before, the tag still attached. By Monday, she was gone, and I was left with a house full of silence and questions. The days after Vanessa's retreat passed like slow-moving weather, gray, heavy, and unpredictable. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. Not because she was gone, but because her absence made space for things I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. Every room whispered inconsistencies. Every silence grew louder. She returned late Sunday evening, tired and talkative, unpacking with theatrical nonchalance. I listened, watched, nodded, but nothing registered as truth. I began to look back. The mind has a strange way of collecting fragments once you start questioning the foundation. Suddenly, moments that had seemed harmless stood out in full color. I remembered how, a year ago, she'd asked about changing her hairstyle. Something dramatic, she said. She dyed it auburn and started wearing it differently, straighter, sharper. At the time, I thought it was a harmless phase. A new look. But it wasn't just the hair. She changed her wardrobe too. Out went the earth tones and soft cottons, replaced by designer labels and brighter, tighter fits. She began wearing perfume again, one I didn't recognize. Not the lavender blend she'd always liked, but something heavier, more exotic. I had assumed she just wanted to feel younger. Then came the gym. Vanessa had never been interested in fitness. She used to joke about yoga being glorified stretching and how she preferred gardening for exercise. But almost overnight, she joined a boutique fitness studio downtown. No guest passes. No partners allowed. They offered HIIT classes, infrared saunas, and executive coaching. It seemed over the top for someone who once claimed running was for people being chased. She never came home sweaty. Always fresh, glowing, like she'd gone somewhere else and only put on the gym clothes as a costume. At first, I told myself not to overthink it. People change, after all. But as I kept assembling the pieces, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Her new phone had no notifications visible on the lock screen. The moment it buzzed, she'd grab it like it was part of her body. She used to leave it on the nightstand, sometimes even forgot it in the car. Now it was always with her, bathroom, laundry room, even outside while trimming the hydrangeas. I once glanced over and saw her messaging someone under the name Ray. When I asked who that was, she claimed it was a group chat with the fitness girls. I nodded. But later that night, while she showered, I quietly opened her old iPad, the one she'd long stopped using. To my surprise, it was still connected to her messages. The device hadn't synced in weeks, but what I found there rattled me. A series of texts, not with Ray, but with someone saved only as J. The conversations were flirty, sometimes vague, sometimes bold. Mentions of late-night calls, inside jokes, hidden meaning in otherwise innocent phrases. A photo sent from a downtown hotel room, city lights glowing behind sheer curtains, a wine bottle on a glass table. No faces, But no room for doubt either. I didn't confront her. I closed the iPad, put it back exactly how I found it, and returned to the kitchen like nothing had happened. If she suspected anything, she didn't show it. I started taking notes. Every strange behavior, every new lie, every trip that didn't add up. I wasn't just a husband anymore. I was an observer, detached, deliberate, and quiet. She told me she was going to Des Moines to visit her cousin for the weekend. She packed light, too light. The next morning, while she was in the shower, I opened her suitcase to slip in a folded cardigan she'd forgotten. Something I knew she'd want. Tucked into the side pocket, half concealed behind a small toiletries bag, was a printed plane ticket Chicago O'Hare. Departure, Friday morning. Return, Sunday night. She hadn't mentioned flying anywhere. Her cousin didn't live in Chicago. She didn't even like Chicago. I placed the ticket back, exactly as I'd found it. Zipped the case. Sat in the hallway waiting. When she came out, towel wrapped around her hair, I smiled and offered her the cardigan. She thanked me, kissed me on the cheek, and went on with her packing. She never realized I knew. That weekend, I didn't sit around waiting. I drove out to the address she had written on the fridge under Cousin Beth's. It was a small home on a quiet street near Des Moines. Nobody answered the door. After 20 minutes of hesitation, I called Beth's number from our shared landline. No answer. Later that evening, I received a casual text from Vanessa. Having a great time with Beth. Miss you. It felt mechanical, like she'd drafted it hours before. The lies weren't even careful anymore. That was the most painful part. They were lazy, casual, like she believed I'd never question her. Or worse, that I wasn't worth the truth. One morning, I caught her humming in the bathroom, something she hadn't done in years. She was putting on lipstick, something new in color, a bolder shade. She paused to check her profile in the mirror, smiling softly to herself. I stood outside the door, silent, unseen. I used to love catching her in those private moments. Now they felt like glimpses into someone else's life. She spoke to me less. But when she did, she was oddly warm, overly affectionate, like she was overcompensating. She began talking about growth, about needing space in abstract spiritual ways. She brought home books about self-discovery, energy cleansing, even a small dream catcher she hung above our bed without asking. Our conversations became careful. Her words always pre-cleared in her mind before they reached her mouth. Every answer rehearsed. Every question turned around on me. Once I asked if we could go away together for a long weekend. Just us. Something simple, a cabin, maybe. She hesitated, then said her retreat group was planning a vision weekend around that same time, and she'd already committed. I nodded. She added that she needed this for her personal clarity. I didn't argue. I just wrote the date down. After that, I started keeping a file. Notes, receipts, copies of texts, **TS from the iPad. I wasn't sure yet what I was building. A case? A map? A grave? All I knew was that the woman I had married was living two lives, and I was no longer part of the one she cared about. She stopped making small talk with my friends. She used to ask about my golf buddies, my brother, even the neighbor's new dog. Now she barely looked up when I mentioned anyone. When my niece had her baby, Vanessa sent flowers but didn't visit. She said she had too much on her plate. But I knew. Her plate was full of something else. I began noticing how often she dressed up for things that didn't require it. Groceries, she claimed, or errands. Once, she wore heels and a silk blouse to get a haircut. That evening, I found the blouse in the laundry, smeared with faint traces of cologne. Not hers, not mine. Even her scent had changed. She used to smell like lemongrass and hand lotion. Now there was something unfamiliar on her skin. Muskier, masculine. Every piece of the puzzle made less sense on its own. But together they told a story. A story that hadn't reached its climax yet, but one I could already see the shape of. I was no longer asking, is she lying? I knew the answer. Now I was asking myself, how far has it gone? And what would I do when I found out? There's a specific kind of silence that comes before the storm, dense, waiting, knowing. That's what those days felt like. I was no longer confused or disoriented. I was focused. Every piece I collected now felt heavier, like stacking bricks before a final wall comes crashing down. I didn't know how it would fall. I only knew it would. The moment of truth came on a Wednesday afternoon, triggered not by confrontation but by coincidence. I had gone to City Hall to renew the vehicle registration. Something routine, something I'd done every few years without much thought. The clerk at the counter recognized my last name and made casual conversation, asking if Vanessa and I were still living in the same house near Pine Ridge. I nodded. He smiled, then added, "Saw your wife last weekend at that fundraiser downtown. Looked like she was having a great time." I blinked. Fundraiser. He described the event, formal attire, a rooftop venue, networking. A guest list of professionals and corporate executives. She'd been there with a man, he said, arm in arm, laughing like they just won something. Didn't recognize the guy, he added. But they looked like a power couple. I nodded again, finished the paperwork, and left. My hands were shaking by the time I reached the parking lot. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my old office, flipping through the same files I had opened 100 times. **TS, photos, dates, receipts. My mind kept replaying that phrase. They looked like a power couple. The words clung to me like mold. I needed more. I needed confirmation. Not suspicion. Not interpretation. Something definitive. Vanessa had an old laptop, one she used before switching to her sleek new model. It still sat in the hallway cabinet beneath our tax documents, collecting dust. I pulled it out at 2 a.m., plugged it in and waited. To my surprise, she hadn't wiped it. The laptop still had a browser linked to her old email account, one she rarely used anymore but had never deactivated. The password was saved. Muscle memory took over. My hands moved on their own. I opened the inbox. At first, it looked like spam and subscriptions, clothing discounts, fitness tips, airline promos. But then I found a folder labeled Personal. Inside, a trail unfolded, like footprints across freshly fallen snow. Clear, undeniable, damning. Travel confirmations. Hotel reservations under her maiden name. Payment receipts tied to our joint account, carefully labeled with vague titles like Spa Wellness Package or Consultation Retreat. But it was the photos that gutted me. One email, dated just 3 weeks earlier, was from a luxury hotel in downtown Chicago. The subject, "Your stay with us. Thank you." Attached were images for the guest record. I clicked the link. The browser opened a page with glossy promotional images, followed by timestamped *TS taken for check-in verification. The first image showed Vanessa at the front desk, smiling. The second showed her walking into the elevator with a tall man in a navy blazer. The third showed them at the hotel bar, laughing, leaning in too close. It was him, the man from the iPad messages. Jay. Another email revealed his full name, Jared Cross. He had emailed her flight confirmation using a private domain address. His tone was warm, practiced, confident, like someone used to secrecy. He referenced last weekend, mentioned our place, and added, "Let me know when Veronica lands." Veronica. Took me a second to understand. That was her alias. In a shared Dropbox link, likely forgotten or overlooked, there were photos. Dozens of them. Vacation style. Candids. Luxurious settings. One in particular stole the breath from my lungs. Vanessa, wrapped in a hotel robe, standing on a balcony with Jared behind her. His arm draped around her waist. Her head rested on his chest, champagne in hand. The smile on her face was not forced, not hidden. It was the same smile she used to save for me, in younger years, when we stood barefoot in our first house with no furniture and too much hope. There was no ambiguity left, no half-truths, no misinterpretation. She wasn't being emotionally careless. She wasn't lost or searching for herself. She was having a full-blown affair. Planned, deliberate, deeply embedded into a double life I was never meant to discover. I stared at that photo until the sun came up. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I printed everything. Every email. Every itinerary. Every image. I began building a timeline, each event matched with receipts and her cover stories. One weekend in Denver, supposedly for a mindfulness seminar, coincided with a two-person reservation at a ski resort in Breckenridge. Another trip to visit Aunt Diane perfectly matched a stay at the Four Seasons in Seattle. My mind moved like clockwork. I wasn't heartbroken yet. That would come later. First, I needed clarity. I needed control. I needed to know how deep it went. Jared Cross. The name lingered. I looked him up. He wasn't just a man she met at a hotel. He was a public-facing executive for a high-end real estate firm based in Seattle. His face appeared in magazine articles, business panels, press releases. Well-dressed. Married. No children. His wife's name was Olivia Cross, a federal judge in Clark County. A woman of standing, authority, reputation. I stared at their smiling photo on the firm's press page. Him and Olivia posing in front of a new luxury development. It made my stomach turn. I wondered how many other lies were nested beneath the surface of their world. Vanessa had entangled herself with more than a man. She had stepped into a web, one that could unravel many lives if tugged hard enough, including mine. That night she came home humming. She was wearing a soft blue dress, one I hadn't seen before. Her face looked flushed from wine. She kissed my cheek as she passed and said she'd had a productive day. I nodded, smiled, said nothing, but inside I was already gone. Over the next few weeks I said little, did less, and learned more. I consulted quietly with a lawyer I trusted, a woman named Sylvia Hale. She listened without expression as I laid out the story. I showed her the files, the dates, the photos. Her face remained neutral until she saw the name, Jared Cross. Her brow arched slightly. "You're certain?" she asked. I nodded. She leaned back, crossed her arms, and said only, "This just got very, very interesting." Sylvia explained the implications. If Jared's wife was indeed a federal judge, and Vanessa filed for divorce in her jurisdiction, as she now planned to do, it would constitute a serious conflict of interest. If handled properly, it could change the entire structure of the divorce settlement. It might even open the door to civil consequences, depending on the financial entanglements and ethical breaches. It wasn't just adultery anymore. It was perjury, fraud, intentional misrepresentation. We documented everything. We waited. We prepared. Vanessa, unaware, continued her charade, weekend retreats, late meetings, vague explanations. She made passive comments about unmet needs and emotional evolution. Once, she mentioned wanting to reimagine her life path and floated the idea of a separation with love and dignity. I nodded again. I agreed. I played along. But the truth was locked away in a sealed envelope on Sylvia's desk. It would be opened in court. And when it was, everything would change. Not just for me, but for her, for Jared, and for the woman who had no idea her husband was building a second life behind her back. Justice was no longer a vague hope. It had a name, a file, and a courtroom. And it was coming. Once the truth was laid bare, a strange calm settled in. Not the kind that brings peace, but the kind that hangs over a field before lightning strikes. I wasn't broken. Not yet. I was sharpened. And I knew now that anger, no matter how justified, would only get in the way. This wasn't about winning back dignity or making someone pay. It was about survival, precision, outmaneuvering betrayal on a battlefield I never chose. Sylvia Hale became my shield. From the outside, she looked like someone who could walk through fire and come out untouched. Sharp suits, sharper eyes. Her office wasn't grand, just a corner unit in a small building near the courthouse. But the walls held framed verdicts from major cases she'd buried her teeth into, the kind that made reputations tremble. She didn't offer sympathy. She offered strategy. We met discreetly early mornings, late afternoons. Sometimes in her office, sometimes over coffee in places where no one knew us. Each meeting began the same way. She'd pull out the red binder she kept locked in a drawer labeled Harris and flip to the next tab. Every section told a different part of the story. Email records, credit card statements, travel documents, photos, a timeline of deceit. We reviewed everything meticulously. There was no room for error. Vanessa was playing her own game of manipulation, of image control, of slow legal maneuvering to make herself look like the wronged party. But she didn't know we were already 10 steps ahead. Sylvia brought in a forensic accountant, a man named Ray, quiet and deliberate, the kind of person who could find hidden numbers in a maze of spreadsheets. He analyzed our joint accounts, traced payments that had been labeled as charitable donations or therapy retreats. Some were routed through shell vendors that led directly to hospitality invoices linked to Jared Cross's expense history. One transaction even revealed a double booking, a room Vanessa paid for, and one Jared had expensed to a firm travel account, both under the same address, same weekend. The paper trail wasn't just damning, it was surgical. We filed requests under the Freedom of Information Act for publicly accessible documents about Jared's professional and legal dealings. A subtle but consistent pattern emerged. Vanessa wasn't just a mistress. She was involved in real estate investments alongside Jared, under the alias Veronica Sloan. There were 2 property leases in Seattle where her name appeared buried in documentation. Both were listed under limited partnerships. One even had digital signatures tied to her maiden name's email account. That changed everything, because now it wasn't just an affair. It was cohabitation, shared assets, financial misconduct. And if Vanessa proceeded with filing for divorce, especially in Clark County, where Jared's wife Olivia was a sitting federal judge, we had leverage. Serious leverage. Sylvia explained what would happen. Vanessa, likely working with legal counsel of her own, would attempt to file quietly in a jurisdiction favorable to her, playing the role of a neglected wife, hoping for spousal support, a share of assets, and the house, always the house. That was her emotional anchor. But she wouldn't see what was coming, not until the courtroom lights turned on. We sat across from a wall of legal maps, sketching possibilities like generals before a siege. "She will try to control the narrative," Sylvia said, her finger tapping against a map of legal districts. "But the narrative doesn't matter if the facts strip it bare in public view." I nodded. "And Jared?" Sylvia smiled faintly. "We don't touch Jared. We let his own life implode. That part will take care of itself." We waited for the move. Sure enough, weeks later, I found the envelope tucked neatly on the edge of the kitchen table. It wasn't even sealed. Divorce papers, preliminary filing, citing irreconcilable differences. There were notes in Vanessa's handwriting, things about wanting to do this amicably, asking for the house, half the savings, and a generous monthly stipend. No mention of Jared. No mention of the trips. No acknowledgement of the web she'd spun around our lives. I signed nothing. Instead, I met Sylvia the next morning. We finalized our own filing and prepared to countersue with full documentation. It was around this time that I began working with a private investigator. His name was Clint. Middle-aged, soft-spoken, the kind of man people overlooked. He was retired military, lived out of a truck most days, and had access to surveillance tools that made my head spin. Clint tracked Vanessa's movements for a full 2 weeks. What he found didn't surprise me, but the level of detail chilled me. Vanessa had been flying under the radar using burner phones and encrypted messaging apps. But she was predictable. Clint followed her to a small condo in downtown Seattle. She arrived there directly after her so-called book club weekend and stayed 3 nights. The building was secure, high-end, and registered under a holding company, another one tied to Jared's firm. Clint captured footage. Vanessa entering with a key card, Jared meeting her in the lobby, their exits, their walks, their in asterisk mate gestures. He gave me the flash drive without comment. I didn't watch the footage. I didn't need to. We also found something else. Something we hadn't expected. A hidden account, tied to Vanessa's maiden name and Jared's LLC. It held a balance just under $90,000. A tidy amount siphoned off in slow, precise withdrawals over a year. Some from our joint savings, some from side contracts she had signed in secret. Enough for a quiet escape or a new start. Enough for betrayal to become permanent. Sylvia prepared a sealed exhibit, one that included the footage, the bank data, and the lease agreements. We knew we couldn't present everything at once. Timing mattered. The goal wasn't to embarrass Vanessa. It was to dismantle the story she was preparing to tell, piece by piece, until it collapsed under its own weight. Then the real shift came. Vanessa's divorce petition was submitted in Clark County. On paper, it seemed smart. The judges were known for equitable settlements. Her legal team was based there. She likely assumed the emotional angle would play well. A long-suffering wife married to a withdrawn, emotionally unavailable man. That's how she had been painting me for months. Even her language changed, calling me quiet, distant, closed off. The irony was staggering. Sylvia smiled when she saw the filing. They stepped in it. Because the judge initially assigned to the case, Olivia Cross, Jared's wife, the conflict of interest was instant. We had already prepared for this. Sylvia drafted a motion to submit the sealed file at the initial hearing, requesting a recusal based on judicial conflict and misconduct. We didn't accuse. We simply provided documentation and let the facts speak. The file was airtight. The timelines matched. The evidence was indisputable. And once it was opened, there would be no going back. The week before the hearing, I stopped talking to Vanessa altogether. We lived under the same roof like strangers. She noticed the distance. Her tone changed from sweet to wary. One night, I caught her looking at my laptop when she thought I was asleep. Another time, she asked if I'd talked to anyone legally yet. I shrugged. She didn't press. She couldn't afford to. The night before the court date, I slept soundly for the first time in months. Not because I felt vindicated. Not because I wanted revenge. But because I knew I had finally stopped being the man who waited. Now, I was the man she never saw coming. It was a Thursday morning when everything came undone. The courthouse in Clark County stood tall and indifferent, its sandstone facade weathered by decades of broken promises and silent verdicts. Inside, the air was cool and sterile, carrying the soft murmur of clerks, attorneys, and litigants weaving in and out of rooms like currents through a stone maze. I arrived early, dressed in a dark gray suit I hadn't worn since my daughter's wedding. I didn't wear it for Vanessa. I wore it for closure. Vanessa walked in 20 minutes later with her attorney, a polished woman named Bethany McCall, known for spinning even the bleakest circumstances into something noble. Vanessa wore a navy blue dress, pearls around her neck, and a carefully tailored expression that looked somewhere between righteous sadness and poised restraint. She gave me a brief glance, unreadable, as though we were business partners settling a quiet disagreement. She looked like a woman prepared to perform. The courtroom wasn't crowded. Just a few observers, a clerk, a bailiff, and the presiding judge, Olivia Cross. She sat elevated, composed in her black robe, her hair pulled into a tight bun. The irony hadn't missed her either. You could see it in the way she paused before addressing the docket. Her voice was calm, but distant. She welcomed both legal teams, then motioned for proceedings to begin. Bethany started with a detailed narrative, Vanessa's narrative. She spoke of a long marriage marred by emotional distance and neglect. How Vanessa had carried the weight of a hollow household. How she had sacrificed her dreams for my stability. How the relationship had eroded to nothing more than polite cohabitation. She described me as detached, uncommunicative, and unwilling to evolve. There were subtle implications that I might have been emotionally withholding, possibly even manipulative. It wasn't blatant slander, it was careful framing. Just enough to tilt sympathy in Vanessa's favor without overreaching. Vanessa's face, as her attorney spoke, was solemn. She nodded gently at key phrases. She dabbed her eye with a tissue at the mention of unreciprocated love. She even let her voice tremble when asked how the living situation had affected her health. "I just want peace," she said, "and fairness." I sat still. My hands never moved from my lap. When it was Sylvia's turn, she stood slowly, deliberately, as if the weight of her file demanded reverence. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't posture. She simply stated, "We have a motion for judicial recusal based on conflict of interest." The room shifted. The judge blinked. "On what basis?" Sylvia approached the bench and handed over the sealed exhibit we had prepared. Every page, every timestamp, every image cataloged and indexed with clinical precision. She didn't summarize. She didn't need to. The first few pages alone told the story. A Seattle apartment lease signed by Jared Cross and Veronica Sloan. A secondary lease cross-reference to Vanessa's legal maiden name. Photographic documentation of Vanessa and Jared exiting a hotel together in Chicago. Multiple joint expenditures between them: lodging, luxury dinners, and spa services. A breakdown of their hidden joint account. And finally, the marriage certificate between Olivia and Jared Cross. There was a long silence as Judge Cross read through the documents. Her expression didn't crack. Not at first. But I watched closely, and I saw the exact moment she recognized the truth. Not just that her husband was cheating. Not just that his mistress was standing in front of her, pretending to be a victim. But that she, a sitting judge, had nearly presided over her own humiliation. Her fingers froze on a page. The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the wall clock behind the clerk. Vanessa shifted in her chair. Her face, painted with carefully curated emotion just moments before, had gone pale. She glanced toward her attorney, who now looked visibly tense, her jaw tightening as she scanned the documents Sylvia had submitted. Judge Cross finally spoke. Her voice, once measured, was now cold. This court acknowledges a direct conflict of interest. Effective immediately, I recuse myself from this case. Bethany stood, clearly flustered, and began to speak, asking for clarification, requesting a private conference. But Olivia raised a hand. Counsel, the documentation speaks for itself. I will not hear this case. It will be reassigned. With that, she rose and left the bench. No gavel. No declaration. Just silence. What followed was chaos. Quiet, careful chaos. Vanessa's attorney whispered furiously to her. Vanessa, for the first time, didn't speak. Her eyes remained locked on the bench where the judge had just been. You could see her mind trying to rearrange the pieces, trying to salvage a narrative that had just been set on fire in front of everyone. The clerk instructed both parties to remain available for reassignment notices. The courtroom emptied slowly. Outside, the press was waiting. Someone had tipped them off. Likely a clerk, possibly another attorney. Cameras snapped as Vanessa exited the building.